An Introduction to Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1. This text is the first in a series of 3 volumes in which Foucault provides a genealogy of sexuality in the Western world. His aim is to examine an example of societal hypocrisy in which it speaks at length about something it claims to silence, in order to better understand the power apparatuses that function in modern society. The book is chunked into 5 different parts. In Part 1, We Other Victorians, Foucault introduces his concept of the repressive hypothesis, poses his research question, and provides a general outline for the book. In Part 2, titled The Repressive Hypothesis, Foucault evaluates the validity of the repressive hypothesis at length. In Part 3, Scientia Sexualis, Foucault compares Scientia Sexualis to Ars Erotica in order to examine the way in which the West has created a relationship between sex and truth through confession and science. Part 4, The Deployment of Sexuality, provides somewhat of a roadmap for Foucault's analysis or deep dive into the history of sexuality. And finally, in Part 5, titled Right of Death and Power over Life, Foucault examines sovereign power and the rise of what he terms biopower. All right, let's jump into the text. Part 1, We Other Victorians. The book begins by laying the framework for the repressive hypothesis. According to Foucault, as, quote, the story goes, at the beginning of the 17th century, people engaged in sexual practices in society without a need for secrecy. However, during the Victorian era, sexual practices were moved into the privacy of the home. And, quote, on the subject of sex, silence became the rule, end quote. Sex, as the story goes, became repressed and maintained through the law. Anyone who did not conform to the sexual repression of the Victorian era, such as prostitutes, clients, pimps, hysterics, or as Foucault would refer to them as the, quote, other Victorians, end quote, soon found themselves institutionalized. According to the story, this repression continues to today. That we are only able then to free ourselves from the repression that links power, knowledge, and sexuality through transgressions of law, lifting of prohibitions, an interruption of speech, a reinstating of pleasure, and a, quote, whole new economy in the mechanisms of power. But Foucault encourages us to stop and think critically for a minute about this story and its historical context. According to Foucault, the story seems to be convincing because the advent of the age of repression in the story coincides with the development of capitalism. It, quote, becomes an integral part of the bourgeois order, end quote. Sex, therefore, became a part of the machinery of the modes of production. However, Foucault notes in, quote, the sexual cause, the demand for sexual freedom, but also for the knowledge gained from sex and the right to speak about it, thus becomes legitimately associated with the honor of a political cause. Sex, too, is placed on the agenda for the future, end quote. Foucault provides another explanation as to why it may be gratifying to define the relationship between sex and power in terms of repression and what he calls the speaker's benefit. So what is the speaker's benefit? Well, according to Foucault, and quote, if sex is repressed, that is, condemned to the prohibition, non-existence, and silence, then the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. A person who holds forth in such language places himself to a certain extent outside the reach of power. He upsets established law. He somehow anticipates the coming freedom, end quote. For Foucault, this explains the intentionality to subvert inherent in speech acts today. The speaking of a tomorrow sex, always seeking liberation, but never arriving at it. In this new economy, officials are paid to listen and patients encouraged to divulge their sex secrets. Foucault again encourages us to interrupt this narrative, and he states, in quote, but it appears to me that the essential thing is not this economic factor, but rather the existence in our era of a discourse in which sex, the revelation of truth, the overturning of laws, the proclamation of a new day to come, and the promise of a certain felicity are linked together, end quote. According to Foucault, today sex serves as a support for the ancient form of preaching. He says, and quote, "The statement of oppression and the form of the sermon refer back to one another. They are mutually reinforcing," end quote. To say that the relationship between sex and power is not characterized by repression is to, quote, risk falling into a sterile paradox, end quote, that runs counter to the whole economy of discursive interests that support the repressive hypothesis. And this very hypocrisy is the point at which Foucault situates the history of sexuality. In this series, he asks not, quote, why are we repressed, end quote, but, quote, why do we say with so much passion and so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present and against ourselves, that we are repressed? By what spiral do we come to affirm that sex is negated? What led us to show ostentatiously that sex is something we hide, to say it is something we silence, end quote. In his analysis of the repressive hypothesis, Foucault proposes three major doubts or questions. The first is a historical question. Is repression a historical fact? Two, he proposes a historical theoretical question. Do the workings of power belong in the category of repression? And third, he poses a historico-political question. Quote, did the critical discourses that addresses itself to repression come to act as a roadblock to a power mechanism that had operated unchallenged up to that point? Or is it not, in fact, part of the same historical network as the thing it denounces by calling it repression? End quote. For Foucault, the point of proposing these three doubts or questions is not to prove the repressive hypothesis inaccurate through counter-arguments. Instead, he aims to examine discourses on sex to better understand the relationship between power and knowledge. He states, in quote, the object, in short, is to define the regime of power, knowledge, pleasure that sustains the discourse on human sexuality in our part of the world, end quote. Again, he's not looking to see if one has sex or not, prohibits it or not. But what he is looking at, end quote, is to account for the fact that it is spoken about, to discover who does the speaking, the positions and viewpoints from which they speak, the institutions which prompt people to speak about it, and which store and distribute the things that are said, end quote. And this sets the groundwork for the remainder of the text, in which Foucault aims to figure out the ways in which sex was put into discourse, to search, quote, instead for instances of discursive production, of the production of power, of the propagation of knowledge, end quote. In his first chapter, The Incitement to Discourse, Foucault argues that discourses on sex have not quieted but multiplied. He tackles the historical question and asks, whom does the speaking? From which position do they speak? And by what institutions are they incited to do so? According to Foucault, in the 17th century, through confession, every desire of the flesh was transformed into discourse. In the 18th century, discourses on sex again multiplied as scientific investigation into the body and mind exploded. Sex then became a police matter, or a, quote, ordered maximization of collective and individual forces, end quote. For example, the emergence of the concept of the population as an economic and political problem, paralleled with the scientific investigation into truth-finding and sex. An Introduction to Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Part 2. In Part 2, titled The Repressive Hypothesis, Foucault examines the repressive hypothesis through a history of sexuality in the Western world. Chapter 1, The Incitement to Discourse. In this chapter, Foucault argues that discourses on sex have not quieted but multiplied. He notes that when we look back over the last 3 centuries and the continual transformation of these 3 centuries, things appear quite different than what is proposed in the repressive hypothesis. According to Foucault, quote, around and approprious of sex, one sees a veritable discursive explosion, end quote. But more important for Foucault was, quote, the multiplication of discourses concerning sex in the field of the exercise of power itself, an institutional incitement to speak about it and to do so more and more, a determination on the part of the agencies of power to hear it spoken about and to cause it to speak through explicit articulation and endlessly accumulated detail, end quote. Foucault begins by looking at the Catholic Church from the Middle Ages up to the 17th century, and he argues that, and quote, while the language may have been refined in regard to sex, and quote, the scope of the confession of the flesh, continually increased, end quote. The increasing importance placed on confession further fused the, quote, meeting line of the body and soul, end quote. So the incitement to discourse, the scheme for Foucault, is what transformed sex into discourse. However, the only thing that's different about the 17th century was how widely the practice of confession had spread throughout society. Foucault continues, this is the essential thing, quote, that Western man has been drawn for the last 3 centuries to the task of telling everything concerning his sex. That since the classical age, there has been a constant optimization and an increasing valorization of the discourse on sex, and that this carefully analytical discourse was meant to yield multiple effects of displacement, intensification, reorientation, modification of desire itself, end quote. Concurrently, while the boundaries of the discourse on sex exploded, a complex organization emerged, an, quote, apparatus for producing an even greater quantity of discourses on sex, capable of functioning and taking effect in its very economy, end quote. Foucault notes that, quote, toward the beginning of the 18th century, there emerged a political, economic, and technical incitement to talk about sex, end quote. And this incitement occurred not so much in the form of theory, but in the form of quantification, and the attempt to, quote, produce a discourse on sex that would not derive from morality alone, but from rationality as well, end quote. While sex continued to become a subject of scientific investigation, it also became a police matter or public matter. For example, the concept of population. Foucault notes, and quote, one of the great innovations in the techniques of power in the 18th century was the emergence of the population as an economic and political problem, end quote. And at the heart of this problem was sex, which created this need for the state to regulate marriage, to regulate the birth rate, to continue to quantify and analyze and control the population that it had created. He states, quote, it was essential that the state know what was happening with its citizens' sex and the use they made of it, but also that each individual be capable of controlling the use he made of it, end quote. In addition, Foucault argues that the regime of discourses regarding children's sex have also changed considerably over the last 3 centuries. He states, and quote, there is not one but many silences, and they are an integral part of the strategies that underlie and permeate discourses, end quote. According to Foucault, pedagogical institutions since the 18th century have not become silent on the topic of sex, but have, quote, multiplied the forms of discourse on the subject. It has established various points of implantation for sex and has coded contents and qualified speakers, end quote. For Foucault, during the 18th and 19th centuries, discourse on sex exploded through a multiplicity of centers such as medicine, psychiatry, and the criminal justice system. Quote, and these discourses on sex did not multiply apart from or against power, but in the very space and as the means of its exercise, end quote. And apparatuses became abundant everywhere. To quote Foucault, we are dealing less with a discourse on sex than with a multiplicity of discourses produced by a whole series of mechanisms operating in different institutions, end quote. According to Foucault, and quote, what is peculiar about modern societies, in fact, is not that they consigned sex to a shadow existence, but that they dedicated themselves to speaking of it ad infinitum while exploiting it as the secret, end quote. Chapter 2, The Perverse Implantation. Foucault begins this second chapter by confronting the possible objection regarding the multiplicity of legal sanctions aimed at controlling sex in order to create an economically productive society in the modern era. He responds by saying, in quote, "I still do not know whether this is the ultimate objective, but this much is certain: reduction has not been the means employed for trying to achieve it," end quote. He states, in quote, "The 19th century and our own have been rather an age of multiplication, a dispersion of sexualities, a strengthening of their disparate forms, a multiple implantation of perversions. Our epoch has initiated sexual heterogeneities," end quote. According to Foucault, up to the end of the 18th century, three major explicit codes governed sexual practices: canonical law, Christian pastoral, and civil law. And while each determined the difference between licit and illicit in their own way, they, quote, "were all centered on matrimonial relations," end quote. The codes of condemnation made no distinction between violations of normative marriage and normative pleasure. According to Foucault, the discursive explosion in the 18th and 19th centuries led to two massive changes. The first concerning heterosexual monogamy. As heterosexual monogamy functioned as a norm, societal attention moved away from it and looked instead in the direction of deviations from it, and anything that deviated from the norm was considered unnatural. To govern sex, the West conceived of two great systems, according to Foucault: the law of marriage and order of desires. Foucault states, in quote, "Although not without delay and equivocation, the natural laws of matrimony and the immanent rules of sexuality began to be recorded on two separate registers," end quote. From this system emerged a whole new category or multiplicity of categories of perversions that have, from the end of the 18th century to today, circulated throughout society. So what do these perversions or peripheral sexualities signify? The fact that they were given so much attention? Perhaps, Foucault notes, they are examples or evidence of a stricter regime. He states, in quote, "Perhaps the point to consider is not the level of indulgence or the quantity of repression, but the form of power that was exercised," end quote. Looking at the multiplicity of labeling of disparate sexualities, it appears, according to Foucault, end quote, that the function of the power exerted in this instance was not that of interdiction, and that it involved four operations quite different from simple prohibition, end quote. Foucault begins by comparing the power mechanisms present in the prohibition of consanguine marriages, adultery, and modern forms of control of children's sexuality. He argues that the power mechanisms are not the same because the tactics employed are not the same. Today, attempts to regulate children's sexuality has resulted in an explosion of professionals looking to identify, contain, monitor any potentiality which has proliferated children's sexuality. Quote, "Power advanced and multiplied while its target expanded, subdivided, and branched out," end quote. Thus, he concludes, and quote, "In appearance, we are dealing with a barrier system, but in fact, all around the child, indefinite lines of penetration were disposed," end quote. The second type of operation that Foucault identifies is the incorporation of perversions and new specification of individuals. He specifically notes that in the 19th century, homosexual became a personage. He states, and quote, "We must not forget that the psychological, psychiatric, medical category of homosexuality was constituted from the moment it was characterized," end quote. Third, he looks at the medicalization of sexuality as an example of the perpetual spirals of power and pleasure. He states, and quote, "The medical examination, the psychiatric investigation, the pedagogical report, and family controls may have the overall and apparent objective of saying no to all wayward or unproductive sexualities. But the fact is that they function as mechanisms with a double impetus, pleasure and power," end quote. And finally, 4, devices of sexual saturation. Here he argues that modern society has proliferated, quote, groups with multiple elements and a circular sexuality, a distribution of points of power, hierarchized and placed opposite to one another, end quote. Therefore, he concludes that, quote, this power had neither the form of the law nor the effects of the taboo. On the contrary, it acted by multiplication of singular sexualities. It did not set boundaries for sexuality, it extended the various forms of sexuality, pursuing them according to lines of indefinite penetration. It did not exclude sexuality, but included it in the body as a mode of specification of individuals, end quote. Therefore, Foucault concludes that we, quote, must abandon the hypothesis that modern industrial societies ushered in an age of increased sexual repression, end quote. And thus he concludes part 2 with, and quote, never have there existed more centers of power, never more attention manifest and verbalized, never more circular contacts and linkages, never more sites where the intensity of pleasures and the persistency of power catch hold, only to spread elsewhere, end quote. An Introduction to Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Part 3. Part 3 is comprised of a single chapter titled Scientia Sexualis. In this section of the text, Foucault compares the Western Scientia Sexualis to Eastern Ars Erotica, in which the West has, through confession, aimed to uncover the truth of sex. For Foucault, the scientific investigation into sex has significantly altered the discourses on sex. He states, and quote, in the name of a biological and historical urgency, it justified the racisms of the state, which at the time were on the horizon. It grounded them in truth, end quote. And in doing so, discourses on human sexuality started to follow two distinct paths. On one hand, a biology of reproduction, and on the other, a medicine of sex. The divergence of these two areas, or their inability to speak to each other, is evidence for Foucault that the discourses that emerged were not aimed to produce knowledge. He states, end quote, a disparity of this sort would indicate that the aim of such a discourse was not to state the truth, but to prevent its very emergence, end quote. Foucault states, end quote, this much is undeniable. The learned discourse on sex that was pronounced in the 19th century was imbued with age-old delusions, but also with systematic blindness, a refusal to see and to understand, but further, and this is the crucial point, a refusal concerning the very thing that was brought to light and whose formulation was urgently solicited, end quote. Foucault continues to discuss the interplay of truth and sex when he states, and quote, the essential point is that sex was not only a matter of sensation and pleasure, of law and taboo, but also of truth and falsehood, that the truth of sex became something fundamental, useful, dangerous, precious, or formidable. In short, that sex was constituted as a problem of truth, end quote. And for Foucault, there have been two great procedures for producing the truth of sex. On one hand, ars erotica, that focuses on pleasure, and on the other, scientia sexualis, that focuses on knowledge. He notes that for ars erotica, end quote, it is experienced as pleasure, evaluated in terms of its intensity, its specific quality, its duration, its reverberations in the body and soul, end quote. And this is distinct from scientia sexualis that arose in the West. According to Foucault, end quote, the West is the only civilization to have developed over the centuries procedures for telling the truth of sex, which are geared to a form of knowledge power, strictly opposed to the art of initiations and the masterful secret. I have in mind the confession, end quote. For Foucault, the connection between confession and the scientific investigation or truth-seeking in sex has produced a form of marking or becoming upon the individual. He states, and quote, the truthful confession was inscribed at the heart of the procedures of individualization by power, end quote. He states that Western man has thus become a confessing animal, and that in doing so, he has shifted to, quote, the infinite task of extracting from the depths of oneself, in between the words, a truth which the very form of the confession holds out like a shimmering mirage, end quote. And according to Foucault, confession has become so ingrained in society that we have become blind to it. He states, and quote, "The obligation to confess is now relayed through so many different points. It is so deeply ingrained in us that we no longer perceive it as the effects of a power that constrains us," end quote. And this integration for Foucault has inverted our conceptions of power. Foucault states, and quote, "For us, it is in the confession that truth and sex are joined, through the obligatory and exhaustive expression of an individual secret. But this time it is truth that serves as a medium for sex and its manifestations," end quote. And this is what distinguishes scientia sexualis from ars erotica. Foucault states, and quote, "By virtue of the power structure immanent in it, the confessional discourse cannot come from above, as in the ars erotica, through the sovereign will of a master, but rather from below, from an obligatory act of speech which, under some imperious compulsion, breaks the bonds of discretion for forgetfulness," end quote. Therefore, truth is a matter of the relationship between the confessor and what it is that they confess. Foucault states, and quote, "The agency of domination does not reside in the one who speaks, but in the one who listens and says nothing, not in the one who knows and answers, but in the one who questions and is not supposed to know. And this discourse of truth finally takes effect, not in the one who receives it, but in the one from whom it is wrested," end quote. The use of the confession in fields like psychiatry are, for Foucault, examples of the discourse of science, or what he calls a confessional science, end quote. How did sexual confession come to be constituted in scientific terms? According to Foucault, through a clinical codification of the inducement to speak, through the postulate of a general and diffuse causality, through the principle of a latency intrinsic to sexuality, through the method of interpretation, and through the medicalization of the effects of confession. For Foucault, sexuality is the correlative of that slowly developed discursive practice which constitutes scientia sexualis. The essential features of this sexuality correspond to the functional requirements of a discourse that must produce its truth," end quote. Therefore, society in the 19th century did not quiet sex, but, quote, "put into operation an entire machinery for producing true discourses concerning it," end quote. He states, and quote, "We demand that sex speak the truth, and we demand that it tell us our truth, or rather the deeply buried truth of that truth about ourselves, which we think we possess in our immediate consciousness," end quote. Foucault states that, quote, "From this interplay there has evolved over several centuries a knowledge of the subject, a knowledge not so much of his form, but of that which divides him, determines him perhaps, but above all causes him to be ignorant of himself," end quote. For Foucault, it isn't the case that ars erotica has vanished from Western society. Instead, it has been incorporated into the scientific investigation into the truth of sex. He states, and quote, "Perhaps this production of truth, intimidated though it was by the scientific model, multiplied, intensified, and even created its own intrinsic pleasures. Pleasure in the truth of pleasure, the pleasure of knowing that truth, of discovering and exposing it, the scientific pleasure of the true discourses on pleasure," end quote. Foucault concludes this section by stating that we have to look at these mechanisms and take them seriously. Not at repression, but, quote, "We must begin with these positive mechanisms insofar as they produce knowledge, multiply discourse, induce pleasure, and generate power." He states, and quote, "In short, we must define the strategies of power that are immanent in this will to knowledge. As far as sexuality is concerned, we shall attempt to constitute the political economy of a will to knowledge," end quote. An Introduction to Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Part 4. Part 4, titled The Deployment of Sexuality, is comprised of 4 chapters. In the introduction to this part, Foucault discusses the investigation into sex as a means of truth-finding. He states, and quote, "Between each of us and our sex, the West has placed a never-ending demand for truth. It is up to us to extract the truth of sex, since this truth is beyond its grasp. It is up to sex to tell us our truth, since sex is what holds it in darkness," end quote. So for Foucault, the Western notion of the self is wrapped up in this logic of sex. He states in quote, to direct the question of what we are to sex, not so much to sex as representing nature, but to sex as history, as signification and discourse. We have placed ourselves under the sign of sex, but in the form of a logic of sex, rather than of physics, end quote. And for Foucault, this logic of sex has become the explanation for everything. Foucault uses Diderot's tale as an analogy in which a genie finds a ring that, quote, when turned, makes the sexes one encounters speak, end quote. So he argues that, quote, our problem is to know what marvelous ring confers a similar power on us and on which master's finger it is placed, what game of power it makes possible or presupposes, and how it is that each one of us has become a sort of attentive and imprudent sultan with respect to his own sex and that of others, end quote. And this is the direction of the remainder of the book. To accomplish this investigation, Foucault states that he must first explain the objective, method, domain, and periodization of the investigation, which he does in each of the chapters in Part 4. Chapter 1, titled Objective. At the beginning of the chapter, Foucault argues that, quote, the assertion that sex is not repressed is not altogether new, end quote, looking at psychoanalysis as evidence. However, for Foucault, psychoanalysis also operates within the paradigm of the confession. Therefore, he argues that, quote, the aim of the inquiries that will follow is to move less toward a theory of power than toward an analytics of power, that is, toward a definition of the specific domain formed by relations of power and toward a determination of the instrument that will make possible its analysis, end quote. What Foucault means by this is that he does not aim to establish and support a major theory and make predictions. Instead, he aims to define, shed light on concepts such as sexuality that are socially constructed within a particular historical context in order to open up the possibility to think differently about them. For Foucault, this analytics can only be possible if, quote, it frees itself completely from a certain representation of power, what he terms juridico-discursive. According to Foucault, this analytics must divorce itself from this understanding of the relationship between the law and desire because they lead to two contrary results. He states, in quote, either to the promise of a liberation if power is seen as having only an external hold on desire, or if it is constitutive of desire itself, to the affirmation you are always already trapped, end quote. Furthermore, he argues that these contradictions, evident in the law as constituting or externally holding the thing which it claims to hold/constitute, is not peculiar to sex, but, quote, deeply rooted in the history of the West, end quote. Some of the principal features of it include the negative relation to power, the insistence of the rule, the cycle of prohibition, the logic of censorship, and the uniformity of the apparatus. The theme that power represses sex and that the law constitutes desire leads to a conception of power that lacks potential. Foucault notes, in quote, it is only a power to say no, in no condition to produce, capable only of posting limits. It is basically anti-energy. This is the paradox of its effectiveness. It is incapable of doing anything except render what it dominates incapable of doing anything either, except for what this power allows it to do, end quote. And this formulation of power in terms of the law is nothing new. Foucault states, in quote, law was not simply a weapon skillfully wielded by monarchs. It was the monarchic system's mode of manifestation and the form of its acceptability. In Western societies since the Middle Ages, the exercise of power has always been formulated in terms of law, end quote. And Foucault points out that in the 18th and 19th centuries, while Western societies have somewhat rejected the conception of the absolute monarch as arbitrary and abusive, they have maintained the very system of law that had constituted the monarchic power. Foucault argues, in quote, despite the efforts that were made to disengage the juridical sphere from the monarchic institutions and to free the political from the juridical, the representation of power remained caught within this system, end quote. Therefore, quote, despite the differences in the epochs and objectives, the representation of power has remained under the spell of monarchy, end quote. Foucault concludes the chapter that, quote, "We must construct an analytics of power that no longer takes law as a model and a code. We must at the same time conceive of sex without the law and power without the king," end quote. Chapter 2, titled Method. Foucault begins Chapter 2 by reiterating the objective when he states, and quote, "Hence the objective is to analyze a certain form of knowledge regarding sex, not in terms of repression or law, but in terms of power," end quote. And to do this, Foucault must first distinguish what he means by power from what he does not mean by power. According to Foucault, power is not a group of institutions and mechanisms that ensure subservience, nor a mode of subjugation, nor a general system of domination. For Foucault, power is, quote, "the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. A process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them, thus forming a chain or a system, or on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another. And lastly, as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of the law in the various social hegemonies," end quote. In order to examine power as a grid of intelligibility, we must not look for a central point, but for, quote, "the omnipresence of power, not because it has the privilege of consolidating everything under its invincible unity, but because it is produced from one moment to the next, at every point, or rather in every relation, from one point to another. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere," end quote. And from this conception of power, Foucault argues that we can advance a certain number of propositions. First, that, quote, "power is not something that is acquired," end quote. And, quote, "relations of power are not in a position of exteriority with respect to other types of relationships, such as economic processes, knowledge relationships, or sexual relationships," end quote. And, quote, "power comes from below. That is, there is no binary and all-encompassing opposition between rulers and ruled at the root of power relations," end quote. Quote, "power relations are both intentional and non-subjective," end quote. And finally, quote, "where there is power, there is resistance, and yet, or rather consequently, that this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power," end quote. This conceptualization of power is the method that Foucault wishes to employ. He states, and quote, "It is in this sphere of force relations that we must try to analyze the mechanisms of power. In this way, we will escape from the system of law and sovereign which has captivated political thought for such a long time," end quote. To do this, we must look at the specifics. We must ask, and quote, "in a specific type of discourse on sex, in a specific form of extortion of truth, appearing historically in specific places, what were the most immediate, the most local power relations at work," end quote. In conducting this investigation, Foucault provides 4 cautionary tales or pieces of advice, what he calls, first, the rule of immanence, second, rules of continual variation, third, the rule of double conditioning, and fourth, the rule of the tactical polyvalence of discourses. Chapter 3, Domain. Foucault ends this chapter by discussing sexuality. He states, and quote, "It appears rather as an especially dense transfer point for relations of power between men and women, young people and old people, parents and offspring, teachers and students, priests and laity, and administration and a population," end quote. Therefore, Foucault argues, quote, "there is no single, all-encompassing strategy valid for all of society and uniformly bearing on all of the manifestations of sex," end quote. In his search for the various manifestations of sex, Foucault identifies 4, quote, "great strategic unities that," end quote, "begin in the 18th century, formed specific mechanisms of knowledge and power centering on sex," end quote. And these include a historization of women's bodies, a pedagogization of children's sex, a socialization of procreative behavior, and a psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. And this led to the emergence of four figures in the 19th century: the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the Malthusian couple, and the perverse adult. And each of these figures were both objects of knowledge and points for the ventures of knowledge. In conjunction with the four great strategic unities produced sexuality. Foucault notes in quote, "What was involved, rather, was the very production of sexuality," end quote. In addition, Foucault argues that alongside the relation of sex rose the conception of alliance. He states in quote, "It will be granted no doubt that relations of sex gave rise in every society to a deployment of alliance, a system of marriage, of fixation and development of kinship ties, of transmission of names and possessions," end quote. And for Foucault, in the 18th century and onward in Western society, this conception of alliance has transformed now into a new apparatus known as sexuality. He states in quote, "I am speaking of the deployment of sexuality. Like the deployment of alliance, it connects up with the circuit of sexual partners, but in a completely different way," end quote. Foucault reiterates, in quote, "Sexuality was taking shape, born of a technology of power that was originally focused on alliance," end quote. And this brings us to the family. Foucault states, and quote, "The family in its contemporary form must not be understood as a social, economic, and political structure of alliance that excludes or at least restrains sexuality, that diminishes it as much as possible, preserving only its useful functions. On the contrary, its role is to anchor sexuality and provide it with a permanent support," end quote. Furthermore, he states, in quote, "The family is the interchange of sexuality and alliance. It conveys the law and the juridical dimension in the deployment of sexuality, and it conveys the economy of pleasure and the intensity of sensations in the regime of alliance," end quote. As a central point of sexuality, it should not be surprising, says Foucault, that psychoanalysis places the parent-child relationship at the root of everyone's sexuality. He states, in quote, "Psychoanalysis, whose technical procedures seem to place the confession of sexuality outside family jurisdiction, rediscovered the law of alliance, the involved workings of marriage and kinship and incest at the heart of the sexuality as the principle of its formation and the key to its intelligibility," end quote. Therefore, Foucault concludes the chapter by stating, in quote, "Hence the domain we must analyze in the different studies that will follow the present volume is that deployment of sexuality, its formation on the basis of the Christian notion of the flesh, and its development through the four great strategies that were deployed in the 19th century. The sexualization of children, the hysterization of women, the specification of the perverted, and the regulation of populations, all strategies that went by way of a family which must be viewed not as a powerful agency of prohibition, but as a major factor of sexualization," end quote. Chapter 4, Periodization. In the beginning of the chapter, Foucault two great ruptures in the history of sexuality if one follows the repressive hypothesis. The first occurring in the 17th century, characterized by great prohibitions, and the second, the 20th century, characterized as an age of loosening of those grips. And he states that we must, in quote, "attempt to trace the chronology of these devices, the inventions, instrumental mutations, and the renovations of previous techniques. But there's also the calendar of their utilization to consider, the chronology of their diffusion and of the effects they produced," end quote. First, he says that they go way back in history, and that it was at the end of the 18th century that, quote, "there emerged a completely new technology of sex," end quote, that had divorced itself from the church, but maintained its attachment to the conception of sin. Quote, "Through pedagogy, medicine, and economics, it made sex not only a secular concern, but a concern of the state as well. To be more exact, sex became a matter that required the social body as a whole and virtually all of its individuals to place themselves under surveillance," end quote. And that it expanded along three axes: pedagogy, medicine, and demography. And from the turn of the 19th century, quote, technology of sex was ordered in relation to the medical institution, the exigency of normality, and the problem of life and illness. The flesh was brought down to the level of the organism, end quote. And this provided for the opportunity for changes in the 19th century, one of which was a separation of the fields of sex from that of the body. Foucault states in quote, whence the medical, but also political, project for organizing a state management of marriages, births, and life expectancies, sex and its fertility had to be administered. The medicine of perversions and programs of eugenics were two great innovations in the technology of sex in the second half of the 19th century, end quote. And for Foucault, psychiatry, jurisprudence, legal medicine, agencies of social control, etc., all of it, quote, an entire social practice which took the exasperated but coherent form of a state-directed racism, furnished this technology of sex with a formidable power and far-reaching consequences, end quote. And it is this genealogy of all these techniques that demonstrates not a decline in the production of sexuality, as argued by the repressive hypothesis, but a steady growth. Having considered this chronology, he then turns to a second analysis and examines their utilization, diffusion, and effects. Looking at bourgeois society, he states, and quote, it was in the bourgeois or aristocratic family that the sexuality of children and adolescents was first problematized and the feminine sexuality medicalized. It was the first to be alerted of the potential pathology of sex, the urgent need to keep it under close watch, and to devise a rational technology of correction, end quote. Through this process, quote, what was formed was a political ordering of life, not through an enslavement of others, but through an affirmation of self, end quote. And it is through this confirmation of the self, in conjunction with bourgeois blood, that emerged a class body. He states, end quote, sexuality is originally historically bourgeois, and that in its successive shifts and transpositions, it induces specific class effects, end quote. An Introduction to Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Part 5. Part 5, titled The Right of Death and Power Over Life. Foucault begins this chapter by defining what he terms sovereign power as, quote, the right to decide life and death, end quote. However, Foucault noted that this power was not absolute. It was, in fact, quote, conditioned by the defense of the sovereign and his own survival, end quote. So the sovereign could only exercise this power over life if his own power or life was in jeopardy. And this right, which, quote, was formulated as power of life and death, was in reality, according to Foucault, the right to take life or let live, end quote. However, Foucault argues that since the classical age, the West has undergone a massive transformation. He states, in quote, there has been a parallel shift in the right of death, or at least a tendency to align itself with the exigency of a life-administering power and to define itself accordingly. This death that was based on the right of the sovereign is now manifest as simply the reverse of the right of the social body to ensure, maintain, or develop its life, end quote. And one example is the modern sort of logic of Western warfare. He states in quote, wars are no longer waged in the name of a sovereign who must be defended. They are waged on behalf of the existence of everyone. Entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter in the name of life necessity. Massacres have become vital, end quote. Another example of this change, according to Foucault, is the death penalty, which posed a particular contradiction. He says, in quote, as soon as power gave itself the function of administering life, it made it more and more difficult to apply the death penalty. And the justification then shifted from protecting the monarch to protecting the people. And the focus from the crime to the criminal. He states, in quote, one had the right to kill those who represented a kind of biological danger to others. In the 17th century, Foucault argues, quote, power over life evolved in two basic forms, end quote. He says the body as machine, which, quote, was ensured by the procedures of power that characterized the disciplines and anatomy politics of the human body, end quote. and on the other hand, the species body, whose, quote, supervision was effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the population, end quote. Foucault states, and quote, the disciplines of the body and the regulations of the population constituted the two poles around which the organization of power over life was deployed. The setting up in the course of the classical age of this great bipolar technology, anatomic and biological, individualizing and specifying, directed toward the performances of the body with attention to the processes of life, characterized by a power whose highest function was perhaps no longer to kill, but to invest life through and through, end quote. Foucault states, and quote, the old power of death that symbolized sovereign power was now carefully supplanted by the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life, end quote. In the late 18th and early 19th century, explosion in the number of universities, schools, barracks, and workshops occurred, alongside, quote, numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations, marking the beginning of an era of biopower, end quote. Furthermore, he states, and quote, this biopower was without question an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. The latter would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes, end quote. At the same time that capitalism was emerging, so too was the entry of life into history, according to Foucault. He states, and quote, that is, the entry of phenomena peculiar to the life of the human species into the order of knowledge and power, into the sphere of political techniques, end quote. Foucault states, and quote, for the first time in history, no doubt, biological existence was reflected in political existence. The fact of living was no longer an inaccessible substrate that only emerged from time to time amid the randomness of death and its fatality. Part of it passed into knowledge's field of control and power's sphere of intervention, end quote. He reiterates, and quote, it was the taking charge of life, more than the threat of death, that gave power its access even to the body, end quote. And this resulted in a major shift. Foucault notes, and quote, for millennia, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for a political existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question, end quote. The development of biopower also changed the juridical system. Foucault notes, and quote, the law operates more and more as a norm, and that the juridical institution is increasingly incorporated into a continuum of apparatuses whose functions are for the most part regulatory. A normalizing society is the historical outcome of a technology of power centered on life, end quote. And this, quote, is the background that enables us to understand the importance assumed by sex as a political issue. It was at the pivot of the two axes along which developed the entire political technology of life. On the one hand, it was tied to the disciplines of the body. On the other hand, it was applied to the regulation of populations through all the far-reaching effects of its activity, end quote. And this gave way to an explosion in surveillances, controls, examinations, measures, and assessments, a whole micro-power concerned with the body. Therefore, Foucault states, and quote, sex was a means of access both to the life of the body and the life of the species, end quote. Foucault states, and quote, this is why in the 19th century sexuality was sought out in the smallest details of individual existence. It was tracked down in behavior, pursued in dreams. It was suspected of underlying the least follies. It was traced back to the earliest years of childhood. It became the stamp of individuality, end quote. Foucault concludes, quote, we are in a society of sex, or rather a society with a sexuality. The mechanisms of power are addressed to the body, to life, to what causes it to proliferate, to what reinforces the species, its stamina, its ability to dominate, or its capacity for being used, end quote. The, quote, new procedures of power that were devised during the classical age and employed in the 19th century were what caused our societies to go from a symbolics of blood to an analytics of sexuality, end quote. Foucault continues in quote, "In actual fact, the passage of one to the other did not come about without overlappings, interactions, and echoes," end quote. And for Foucault, two of these collision points are noteworthy: the rise of eugenics and racism, and psychoanalysis and the effort to reinscribe the thematic of sexuality in the system of law. Foucault argues that we must therefore, quote, "conceptualize the deployment of sexuality on the basis of the techniques of power that are contemporary with it," end quote. Finally, Foucault confronts criticism regarding the notion of sex. He states, in quote, "The notion of sex made it possible to group together in an artificial unity anatomical elements, biological functions, conduct, sensations, and pleasures, and it enabled one to make use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle, an omnipresent meaning, a secret to be discovered everywhere. Sex was thus able to function as a unique signifier and as a universal signified," end quote. Thus, the idea of sex makes it possible to evade what gives power its power. It enables one to conceive power solely as law and taboo, end quote. So, for Foucault, end quote, "we must not refer a history of sexuality to the agency of sex, but rather show how sex is historically subordinate to sexuality," end quote. Foucault concludes, in quote, "We must not think that by saying yes to sex, one says no to power. On the contrary, one tracks along the course laid out by the general deployment of sexuality. It is the agency of sex that we must break away from." That is, if we aim through a tactical reversal of the various mechanisms of sexuality to counter the grips of power which the claims of bodies, pleasures, and knowledges, and their multiplicity and their possibility of resistance. The rallying point for the counterattack against the deployment of sexuality ought not to be sex desire, but bodies and pleasures, end quote.